Hi guys, Olive here today to bring you my September 2017 wrap-up and my October TBR. I read 10 books in September, so there's no time to waste. Let's start talking about the books. The first book I read in September was The Professor and the Madman, A Tale of Murder, Insanity, and the Making of the Oxford English Dictionary by Simon Winchester. This is a work of nonfiction telling the story of how the much-esteemed Oxford English Dictionary was created and who was involved in its creation, with a particular focus on one contributor who happened to be a man locked up in an asylum. This man was being jailed in this asylum for a murder that he committed in a fit of madness and paranoia many years prior to him being involved in the creation of the OED. His contributions to the dictionary were nearly endless, and although this was something he was very passionate about, and although everyone knew how important his role was, his identity remained a mystery through most of the project. This book gives a detailed background about this mysterious contributor, Dr. W.C. Minor, and gives a modern-day diagnosis of what he may have been afflicted with. I thought this was a really entertaining and illuminating read, but this is not a very long book, and I would say nearly the first 100 pages of it is dedicated to setup. There's tons of background on the professor who was in charge of the project, tons of background on the Madman, and then a lot of history about dictionaries and how badly a comprehensive one was needed when the OED project got started. Even though the first part of this book was dedicated to setting up the story that it would then go on to tell in the second half, I still found it a fast, entertaining read, certainly a great pick for Nonfiction November coming up. And there's also a movie adaptation coming out of this book. I'm not entirely sure when, but in case that gives you any more motivation to pick this up. The next book I finished in September was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Bronte. This was a book off of my classics I'd like to read in 2017 list, and it was also the first Bronte book I've ever picked up. This is the story of the young mother Helen Graham who moves to the long uninhabited Wildfell Hall with her young son. She ends up being a mysterious figure in her new neighborhood. She's dressed as a widow, but won't reveal any information about her situation. She firmly likes to keep to herself, and she is intensely protective of her child. The locals are at best perplexed by her, and at worst suspicious of her, save for one young man, Gilbert, who begins to fall for her. As he begins to push further into her life and try to ascertain more information about her in the hopes of winning her over, the locals of this neighborhood begin to spread deleterious rumors about Helen. It is at this point that Helen decides to reveal her secrets to Gilbert by giving him her diary, which she began keeping when she was 18 years old. These diary entries reveal years of torment and abuse that Helen has only recently escaped from, but not without a cost. I thought this was a moody and atmospheric read, perfect for this time of year, and certainly very revolutionary considering this was published in 1848. Helen is an extremely strong woman, one who decides to take things into her own hands at a time when it is not just socially unacceptable, but also illegal to do so. I gave this book 4 stars on Goodreads, but in my mind, I feel like it's sitting more at a 3.5. Mainly because the love story between Helen and Gilbert, which kind of bookends Helen's story through her diary entries, was not only irritating, but downright unhealthy. Gilbert feels entitled to attention and explanations from Helen, even after he knows the hell she's been through. He is pushy to the point of being violent, and he acts like a stalker. That's not romantic. That's just more shit Helen doesn't need in her life. It's a book worth reading for Helen's story, but Gilbert can take a long walk off a short cliff. The third book I finished in September was The Essence of Malice by Ashley Weaver. This is the 4th book in the Amory Ames Cozy Mystery series, and as expected, I started to inhale this book the moment it arrived in the mail. I can't say too much about the plot of this book since it is a part of an ongoing series. But I will say that this installment had Amory and her husband Milo investigating the death of an intensely famous parfumier in Paris. This book had probably my favorite story of the series since the first book, Murder at the Brightwell. There has not been a single book in this series so far that has not charmed me to the point of me grinning from ear to ear the whole time I'm reading it. I binged through every single one of them, and then the moment I finish, I feel so incredibly depressed that I have to wait an entire year to read the next one. If you like cozy mysteries and you've not yet picked up any of the books in this series, I cannot encourage you enough to do so. It is beyond wonderful. The next book I finished in September was All That Is Solid Melts Into Air by Dara. The description of this book would have you believe that all of this book is about and set in Chernobyl, and that is not the case. About half of this book is set back in Russia. We follow a small cast of characters in this book. There is a young preteen boy who is a piano prodigy, his mother, his aunt, who is a former dissident writer, but now works at a factory. We also follow his aunt's ex-husband, a surgeon sent to Chernobyl to deal with some of the health issues surrounding the Chernobyl disaster. And then we also focus on a small family who was living just outside of Chernobyl when the disaster occurred. They are forced to leave the area they once called home, along with many others, when it was deemed no longer safe for habitation. I got really excited when I first started reading this book, thinking that the stories of these characters might have really intertwining stories, just like they do in one of my favorite books of all time, The Tsar of Love and Techno. But although the stories of each of these characters are connected, they are not as fully intertwined as they are in that book. My favorite thing about this novel was that there was a very distinct, palpable feeling of this book showing the end of something, if that makes sense. Given that the Soviet Union was on its last legs during the time period that this novel is set, it makes sense that Dara Mcgee made that choice, but he did it so effectively. The representation in this book of just how poorly the Chernobyl disaster was handled, the dusty bureaucracy that allowed it to happen in the first place, and then withheld a proper response in fear of it causing international embarrassment, really drove the point home that this was an empire prime for collapse. The images that this book painted of the immediate effects of the radiation released into the atmosphere and the long-term effects on the human body were heartbreaking and downright nauseating. There is one passage in particular that details just how brutal the long-term effects of radiation are on the human body that I found so haunting that I think it's going to stay with me for the rest of my life. There were undoubtedly moments of brilliance in this book, but I did find myself rather disappointed with the last quarter of the book, particularly the ending. I felt that it lost steam, and not in a way that mimicked the collapse of the Soviet Union. I wish it had been more like, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, with first a bang, then a whimper. But instead, the book really lost focus and the climax came out of nowhere. I would still highly recommend this book, but I was a little disappointed that it didn't end up being a 5-star read for me. The next book I finished in September was Significant Zero: Heroes, Villains, and the Fight for Art and Soul in Video Games by Walt Williams. This book was just released on September 19th. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this book since I have a whole special video planned for it, but this is a memoir of Walt Williams, who is a writer / narrative designer for mainstream video games. In this book, he discusses his experiences so far in his life in the AAA video game industry and divulges just how a video game goes about being made. This is a very honest memoir. At times it is humorous, at times it is self-deprecating. Williams describes himself as mildly narcissistic and certainly portrays himself as a workaholic with an ego, but you can tell that he has real passion for the work he does. The courageous way that he lays everything out there in this book makes it abundantly clear just how much he wants to be honest about the way video games are and how much he wants to have a conversation about how much more they can be, how much more they can do. I thought it was a really great, really fun read, but please do note that this book will spoil some video games for you. It spoils The Last of Us. I know it spoils BioShock. And I'm finding it kind of odd that now 2 wrap-ups in a row, I'm discussing books that spoil the story of BioShock. Not sure how that happened, but it has happened. In a very interesting turn of events, my husband wrote a review of this book for Open Letters Monthly. I will link that down below if you would like to go read it. I highly encourage you to do so. I may be biased, but I think it's awesome. Also, keep an eye out for the special video I have planned for this one. The next book I finished in September was A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab. This is the second book in the Shades of Magic trilogy. I read the first book, I think back in early 2016, and was interested enough in it to move on to the second book. To be completely honest with you, I thought this book was a major letdown. 3/4 of this book are exposition. I remember being halfway through the book and thinking, wow, maybe 2 things have happened so far. It was entirely character-focused with no real story to speak of. At the present moment, I feel absolutely no desire to move on to the 3rd book. Please tell me in the comment section down below if you think I should, but if your argument is that I should, please come ready to convince me, because it's gonna take some convincing. The 7th book I finished in September was Hum If You Don't Know the Words by Bianca Morais. This is a historical fiction novel set in 1970s apartheid Johannesburg, immediately following the Soweto student uprising. A mother of one of the students who participated in this protest is desperately trying to find her daughter after she has gone missing. This mother, Beauty, and a 9-year-old white girl named Robin are brought together after a tragic turn of events in Robin's life. I really don't know how to feel about this book. On one hand, I really enjoyed learning more about the Soweto uprising, since it was an event about which I had no prior knowledge, and I did find it valuable learning more about apartheid and about South African culture. But on the other hand, I found the story really lacking, and I do not think the child narrator was handled well at all. At times, Robin would show the naivete of a child, but at other times she would reveal insight and a voice that was far too mature for her tender age. There were nuggets of good storytelling in here, but not enough to make it an enjoyable read. The next book I finished was Penguin the Magpie, the odd little bird who saved a family. Steve sent me this book after I told him about my transformation into a bird nerd, and I read it immediately when it arrived. This is the true story of how a spunky little magpie joined a human family at a moment of great tragedy. Photographer Cameron Bloom's beloved wife, Sam, suffered an extreme accident while they were vacationing in Thailand, falling off a balcony and critically injuring just about every part of her body, most seriously her spine. This previously intensely active woman, mother of 3 energetic young sons, was told she would never walk again. I don't think the word devastated could even properly cover what she must have been feeling. After leaving the hospital, she sank into a deep, borderline suicidal depression that only began to lift when the family adopted an abandoned magpie chick. At first, caring for this little chick, who the family named Penguin, required around-the-clock care, introducing new purpose into Sam's life. But then later, when Penguin grew up, she provided non-pitying, non-obtrusive companionship and understanding that Sam so desperately needed to rejoin the world in the new way that she was able to. I will admit that I am not the most emotional of people, but this book was an emotional roller coaster ride. I found it incredibly moving, especially getting to hear directly from Sam at the end of the book. But it is also filled with fun and loving moments from this amazing family and their little miracle bird. Plus, gorgeous pictures. The penultimate book I finished in September was The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin by Masha Gessen. This was amazing. I am positively kicking myself that I did not read this sooner. This is, as the title suggests, an account of how Vladimir Putin went from obscurity to becoming the president of Russia. Gessen goes into detail about Putin's early life and the mystery surrounding it. She talks about his ambitions, which he later achieved, to join the KGB. And she also talks about what he did, or rather what he didn't do, to get noticed by the right people to put him in a position of intense power. The questions at the heart of this book: who is Vladimir Putin? What are his motivations? Gessen, in my opinion anyway, answers extremely successfully. To me, this was an extremely straightforward, honest, readable account of Putin's actions from 2000 to 2012. There are a lot of times on this channel where I will talk about a book and say that I can't necessarily recommend it to everyone because not everyone has my background on Russia. I don't always feel with some of the books that I do read on Russia that everyone will get as much out of it as I do. I do not believe that about this book. I think everyone could get as much out of this as I did and should read it considering current events. And the final book I finished in September was Lexicon by Max Barry. This is a science fiction thriller with language at the core. In this book, there is a secret society whose members are known as poets. These individuals undergo rigorous training in order to be able to use words as weapons. Once trained, these individuals can effectively tranquilize and enslave people using the correct set of words depending on each individual person's segment. Think of it as an extreme sci-fi version of being able to persuade someone if you know what they want to hear. A sequence of events is set into motion after the entire population of a very small rural Australian town is wiped out by an all-powerful word called the bear word. Everyone is killed save for one man who seems to be the only person alive immune to Poet's persuasive effects. This man, who is known as the Outlier, and another man who is a former poet, are both on the run from an abnormally powerful member of this organization. This book was super intense and highbrow. I think I'm going to need to give it a reread at a certain point because I'm not sure I got all of it, but good Lord, was this a wild ride. It was one of the most imaginative stories I've ever read in my life. And the writing completely sucked me in. It was funny, it was smart, it was exactly what I wanted. Those were all the books that I finished in September. One that I DNF'd was No One Is Here Except All of Us by Ramona Acebel. I found this extremely irritating. I thought it read like a pretentious play held for hipsters. All of the characters were doing that thing where they just say random lines out into the universe for absolutely no reason, and I just really couldn't take it anymore. It's really a shame because I recently read Sons and Daughters of Ease and Plenty, also by the same author, and really enjoyed it, but this one was no. When it comes to what I am currently reading, I am still working my way through A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. I keep trying and failing to read this one on ebook, so I finally just caved and requested it from the library. Also, unsurprisingly, I am still reading The Romanovs by Simon Sebag Montefiore, not just because of its size, since it's huge, but also because of the very sensationalistic way that it's written. I'm not the biggest fan so far. And then I am also currently reading Vulture, The Private Life of an Unloved Bird by Katie Fallon, because birds. The first book on my TBR for October is The Genius of Birds by Jennifer Ackerman, also because birds. I would also like to read Daughters of Witching Hill by Mary Sherratt because Halloween. Additionally, I would like to read Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope because Victober. I'm also planning on reading Akata Warrior by Nnedi Okorafor when it comes out because I have been waiting forever for this sequel. Then I am planning on dedicating a portion of my reading month to reading books about or set during the Russian Revolution, including Dr. Zhivago and The Zhivago Affair, Caught in the Revolution by Helen Rappaport, Was Revolution Inevitable? Turning Points of the Russian Revolution by Anthony Brenton, and Lenin on the Train by Catherine Meredale. I don't know if I'll get to all of those, but I will definitely try. And then, just in case that TBR wasn't ambitious enough, I'm also going to pick my random book off of my TBR. The first option is The American Heiress by Daisy Goodwin. The second option is Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. And option number 3 is City Folk and Country Folk by Sofia Kvoshchinskaya. I'm seeing that City Folk and Country Folk is the shortest of these 3 options, and considering how ambitious my TBR is this month, I think I'm just going to go with that one. So those were all of the books that I read in September, what I'm currently reading, and what I'm planning to read in October. If you've heard of any of these books, if you've read any of them, if you'd like to read them now that you've heard me talk about them, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below, or you can find me on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles are in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.